Bienvenidos a este segundo día, a nuestra segunda conferencia del tercer día de la Semana de la Comunicación. Muchísimas gracias a todas las personas que están sintonizándonos en este momento. Vamos a dar un poquito de tiempo para que se vayan conectando todos y mientras tanto me gustaría darles la bienvenida con lo que vamos a tener a continuación para ustedes. Bueno, en esta ocasión se realiza en el marco del primer aniversario de la estrategia digital de la UANL. Esto nos ha permitido hacer una Semana Internacional donde hemos contado y seguirán participando ponentes reconocidos como profesores e investigadores de varias latitudes del mundo y por supuesto de nuestro país. Asimismo, agradecemos las facilidades que nos brindan las autoridades universitarias de la Facultad de Ciencias de la Comunicación para el desarrollo de este tipo de actividades, donde ponemos en especial énfasis al estudio de la comunicación de la academia y las más recientes investigaciones a nivel global. La siguiente conferencia será en inglés. Sabemos que muchos de las personas que nos están viendo, pues no es su fuerte o no dominan el idioma. Sin embargo, trataremos de brindarles la mejor traducción posible y también para que pudieran comprender, al final vamos a tener una sección de preguntas y respuestas donde pueden ustedes preguntar en inglés o en español. Nosotros aquí le haremos llegar las preguntas al conferencista o si lo prefieren también pueden encender sus cámaras y nuestro equipo de producción les brindará la oportunidad de participar. Esto, por favor, hacerlo con tiempo. Si ustedes van a participar, tienen todo lo largo de la conferencia para realizar sus preguntas y 5 minutos antes de finalizar, por favor, vayan encendiendo sus cámaras o levantando la mano, haciendo algún comentario de que ustedes quisieran participar con nosotros. Entonces, solo tienen que escribirla en la parte de los comentarios de esta transmisión, ya sea por Facebook o YouTube. Algunos de ellos serán seleccionados por la producción de este evento. Y se invitará a que hagan su pregunta en vivo, en tiempo real, como bien se los menciono. Vamos a dar inicio a esta semblanza. Muchísimas gracias por estar el día de hoy con nosotros. Quiero darle la bienvenida al doctor William Eveland, también conocido como Chip. Bienvenido, Chip. ¿Cómo estás? Buenos días.
Gracias. I want to thank you for having me to give this talk today. I last visited Monterrey about 4.5 years ago. What a beautiful city and beautiful campus with some outstanding scholars. So I'm very excited to be invited to talk to you today. Second, let me apologize to you for having to talk to you in English. Unfortunately, I learned French as a student in school instead of Spanish, and I'm afraid if I attempted to speak Spanish, you would probably understand less than if I spoke English. In any case, I want to also acknowledge several of the people who have contributed to the ideas that I want to talk to you about today. Some former students, current students, and collaborators around the United States, as well as a number of scholars who have gathered data in Latin America, including Mexico, that I'll use in talking to you today. So let me begin.
Video first,
Yep.
and then we're gonna share your presentation. It's okay for you?
Oh yeah, sure. Sorry.
Okay. Vamos a iniciar con un video de la ponencia de nuestro invitado especial y después continuaremos con su presentación. Adelante, producción.
Dr. William Chip Eveland es profesor de Comunicación y Ciencias Políticas en la Universidad Estatal de Ohio. La investigación académica de Eveland se centra en el papel de la comunicación política en el desarrollo de ciudadanos de la democracia, informados y participativos, tanto en Estados Unidos como en todo el mundo. Aunque su investigación inicial se centró en los efectos del uso de los medios de comunicación en el conocimiento y la participación política, más recientemente su trabajo ha destacado en el importante papel de la estructura y el contenido de las redes de discusión política en la democracia. El trabajo más reciente de Eveland enfatiza el importante papel de escuchar en las conversaciones políticas donde hay profundas divisiones, no solo debido al partidismo, sino también a través de líneas de diferencia racial y sobre temas relacionados con la raza. Eveland Ha publicado en los campos de la comunicación, las ciencias políticas, la sociología, la psicología, y gran parte de ese trabajo publicado se ha centrado en la evaluación empírica de la medición de encuestas de conceptos, como el uso de los medios de comunicación, la conversación política, la heterogeneidad, desacuerdo, diversidad de la red, tamaño de la red de discusión y conocimiento político.
Bueno, esa es la bienvenida para Chip, nos acompaña el día de hoy. Dr. Eveland, if you want to start, please, thank you.
Yes, thank you for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you here. What I want to talk to you today about is the idea of listening and how important that is in sort of democracy and in our political lives, and maybe even in our lives outside of the way that politics appears. I want to acknowledge some of the co-authors that I have in my research, some of whom were former students or current students. Some of them are my colleagues at Ohio State University. I also want to acknowledge a number of Latin American scholars who have gathered data that I'll talk about a little bit today in my presentation. So I want to begin with a humorous newspaper that we have in the United States. It's a fake newspaper where they write satirical stories, and while not everyone realizes they're satirical, they are. This newspaper is called The Onion, and over a decade ago, it included this headline, report 60 million people you'd never talk to voting for the other guy. And the joke in here is really that so many people in so many countries, and certainly in my country in 2016 when Donald Trump was elected president, many people were shocked at the election of Donald Trump, maybe in part because they didn't know anyone who actually supported Donald Trump before he was elected. Because people oftentimes don't talk to people who are different than them, who have different viewpoints, different backgrounds, different experiences. And many times, in fact, we absolutely avoid those sorts of people. And so in the spirit of many a truth is said in jest, this humorous headline may in fact be more true than some other headlines that we see in the news media. It turns out this problem or this concern, and I'll explain today in my talk why it is a concern, but this problem with people not talking to those who support different political candidates or different political parties or who are different from them is a problem that exists in many countries, but in your country and in my country, it may be a particular problem. My friend Alejandro Moreno, who is one of the collaborators on the Comparative National Elections Project, on which I participate as well, has gathered data in Mexico during multiple presidential elections during this century. And one of the things that we ask in our comparative national elections surveys is, among the people with whom you've talked about the election campaign, how many tend to agree with you about politics? And if we just look at the percentage of people who say that all or almost all of the people with whom they talk about politics agree with them, we can see that Mexico and the United States have the largest percentage across the studies in the Comparative National Elections Project that we've examined. In 2016 in the US, about 30% of Americans said they pretty much didn't talk to anyone else who supported a different candidate than they did. Therefore, you see kind of the understanding of that headline. And in Mexico in 2018, the percentage was actually even a little bit higher, closer to 35 percentage points. This may be particularly striking, this kind of existence within interpersonal enclaves where you just have people like you, when we look at some of the other countries that were nearly as high as the US and Mexico, but not quite. For instance, the country of Iran in 2016 was pretty much the same level as the United States. Colombia in 2014, before the peace process was finalized, was actually, people had more contact with those who supported a different political candidate or party than did the US or Mexico. South Africa, a country famous for racial segregation and apartheid, had more contact across people who supported different candidates than did the US or Mexico in their elections a few years ago. And so this is a striking, potentially a striking problem if we think it's important for people to talk, at least to some people who hold different viewpoints when it comes to politics. And so I'd like to switch a little bit back and forth between the United States and Mexico, because I'm not an expert in Mexico, but I am an expert in the US. And I'll also share a little bit of data from a couple of other Latin American countries for comparison purposes. But in the US where I live in the state of Ohio, which I show on this map here. It's this kind of strangely shaped state that is a mix of rural areas and urban areas. And my state is often votes in the same direction that the country goes. In fact, for almost 100 years, the state of Ohio tended to vote the same way as the United States in a presidential election. That failed in 2020, and this image shows the results of that election. The blue counties, or what we call the counties, there are about 100 counties in the state of Ohio. The ones that are shaded blue voted for Joe Biden in the 2020 presidential election. The ones that are shaded different colors of red voted for Donald Trump. And what you notice here is that there are very few counties in the state of Ohio who voted for Joe Biden. And those counties all had among the biggest cities in the state. The biggest cities are Columbus, where my university is, Cleveland, and Cincinnati. Those are the three biggest cities. And the next three biggest cities are Dayton, Akron, and Toledo. And so what we see is that the state of Ohio is divided, much like the United States, where people who lived in more rural areas, in the countryside, in the mountains, voted for Donald Trump. And people who lived in the cities were more likely to vote for Joe Biden. So there's kind of a physical separation between people. And this is important when we think about opportunities for individuals to encounter people who have different viewpoints and different backgrounds than they do. And there's really two words that I would define for you to help you understand this. The first is an uncommon word in English, propinquity. Propinquity is basically referring to the supply of what's available to us in our environment. So in my particular neighborhood, there are very few people who support Donald Trump. And so if I just talk to people randomly, it would be hard to encounter someone who supported Donald Trump. In some of these red areas of the state, there are very few people who support Joe Biden. And it would be hard to find somebody to talk to who supported Joe Biden in those areas. And so one of the things that determines who we talk to is an issue of supply or propinquity. The other factor, or one other factor that can determine who we talk to, is called homophily, which, if you translate from the Latin, is basically love of the same, or love of the one's own characteristics. And what this means is that in addition to the choices that are available to people, people typically prefer to seek out and to talk to people who are like them. There is a saying, birds of a feather flock together. People choose those that are similar to them, even if it takes some effort to do so. And this is not just something that happens in the United States. In a terrific book that just came out last year, I hope it's available in Spanish. I've read it in English, Persuasive Peers, Social Communication and Voting in Latin America. We can see this image, which shows the results of the 2006 Mexican presidential election. And the shading of these Mexican states, actually it's by congressional district, but we see the states in there as well. we can see the relative advantage of the two major parties in that 2006 election. And we can see, just if we look at the country as a whole, that there are some dramatic differences between the north of Mexico and the south of Mexico. And also there are differences in terms of urban versus rural distinctions. And if we look more broadly into the research, we see that factors that would determine party support in Mexico during the 21st century tend to be related to wealth differences, which certain wealthier people live in some areas, poorer people live in other areas. Issues of geography, like urban versus rural distinctions, which sometimes are related to wealth. And finally, to religious differences. And so the idea here is that, again, where you live in Mexico may determine the availability of people who are like you and different from you to talk. So even if you're not trying to limit yourself to people who are the same as you, your environment may make some of that choice for you. And there's a sort of interesting comparison that the authors of this book make between Guanajuato and Guerrero as two states that are very different in terms of the candidates they supported in 2006. And what we can see if we look at the sorts of people who were most likely to be talked to in those two states, we see that there is a big influence, even when we take into account lots of different factors, a big influence of the availability of discussion partners in those states on who people talk to. So in Guanajuato, you see that pro-Calderon people were filling the majority of networks for people, where pro-Madrazo was more common in Guerrero. And so much like the United States, actually, in many ways, we see that the state or the congressional district can determine the availability of people to talk to. Now, of course, there's always going to be people around. There's always going to be someone who is different from you who you're able to talk to. But it sometimes could take some effort to find those people, especially when many people make an effort to avoid people who are different from them. Now, also, I understand, I know that the Mexican presidential election in 2018 really changed the map that I showed you on the previous slide, at least in terms of the candidate who won the majority of vote in each of those states. But in fact, the relative strength of the winner in each of those states actually varied a lot by the state of Mexico that you consider. And so this pattern still exists, even though the winner was sort of much more likely to win all but one of the Mexican states. In the United States, this has led to a lot of concern about something that's called affective polarization. And affective polarization is the idea that people who support one political party or the other don't just hold different viewpoints, don't just favor different political policies. They actually dislike, hate even, the people who are supporters of the other party. And so these data, which were gathered by the Pew Research Center less than 2 years ago when Donald Trump was president, show this very clearly. The red bars represent how Republicans think of the opposite party Democrats. So Donald Trump is a Republican, and Joe Biden, the current president, is a Democrat. And we can see that in 2019, somewhere between half and 64% of Republicans thought that Democrats were either a lot more or somewhat more close-minded than other Americans. So the Republicans are attributing this close-minded personality trait to the people in the other party. Democrats did this even more strongly regarding Republicans. Between 70 and 75% of Democrats thought Republicans were more close-minded than average. And then we think about morality. Republicans, about half of Republicans thought Democrats were more immoral than most people. And about a third to a half of Democrats thought the same thing about Republicans. We can see when asked about being lazy, almost half of Republicans thought Democrats were more lazy. Only about 1/5 of Democrats thought Republicans were more lazy. But both groups, about a third, thought the other party was less intelligent, that the people in that party were unintelligent. So this goes beyond differing on trade policy or foreign affairs or taxes or how to address the COVID outbreak. These are ideas of just disliking, hating the other side. And this is dangerous in a democracy. This is a very dangerous thing. And there is a degree, as I understand it, of polarization in Mexico as well. The dimensions currently are not, a Democrat-Republican distinction in the United States, or maybe even not an ideological distinction, but maybe more of a status quo versus an anti-establishment polarization in Mexico. In the United States, the result of this really passionate dislike or hate for the other side has led in the past year to many public opinion polls showing that many people in both political parties, but in the case of the US, just a little bit higher percentage of Republicans, believe that if the other side wins the 2020 election, that violence could be justified. And we saw these polls were coming out in September 2020 in the US. And it was hard to believe that maybe up to a third of Americans thought maybe violence would be justified. And sure enough, on January 6th, 2021, protesters stormed the US Capitol. There were several people who were killed, and they took over the Capitol because they thought that their candidate was cheated out of an election, which is not the case, but they believed that. And apparently some percentage of those people didn't just think that violence might be justified, but they actually came out and engaged in that violence. And this is something that democracy cannot survive. And so I guess my key point thus far in my talk is that we have a serious problem when we have to think about how to resolve that problem. And it may not be just a problem in the US, but it may be a problem that is shared in a number of other countries. In the US, not surprisingly, given some of these ideas that I've shared with you already, about half of the US public reports that they would find it stressful and frustrating to talk about politics with people with whom they disagree. And a little less than half would think that having such conversations would be interesting and informative. And so we see that there's kind of a split, at least up through 2019, about whether people would want to avoid that sort of talk with people who are different versus those that would see some value in it. And so the question may be, what do we know about whether that talk is actually useful or not? What benefits may we gain from this? And that's something that people in my area of research, understanding political conversation and political engagement, have been seeking to answer for 20 years or so. And again, maybe one of the most recent contributions, and certainly a terrific contribution, is this book by Baker, Ames, and Reño on persuasive peers in social communication and voting in Latin America, that moves beyond the American case, where there has been a lot of research that's been done over the past 10 or 15 years, and provides some insight outside of the American context as well, but finds many of the same patterns in Mexico and Brazil, for instance, as we find in the United States. So the question maybe becomes, why am I arguing to you that it's important for people with different political beliefs to talk to each other? Why do we have to suffer through this? Why do we have to experience this thing that so many people think of as being uncomfortable, and that may even be difficult to do because we have to seek out those other people because maybe they don't live in our neighborhood. Maybe they don't even live in our city. We have to go outside the city boundaries into the countryside, or we have to make some efforts to interact with people who are part of smaller demographic subgroups, people who don't share the majority religious beliefs, people who don't have the majority racial or ethnic makeup. And so it's challenging, it's hard. So why should we do this? And theory and research has some answers to these questions. Diana Mutz, who was a professor in my department for some time, she was also my professor for a little time when I was in graduate school, has argued and provided evidence that there are at least 3 benefits to exposing yourself to political disagreement, particularly through conversations about politics with people who don't share your political viewpoints. And the first of these is that when you talk to people who have different viewpoints than you do, you simply become aware of the reasons that they hold their ideas, okay? So you may think a particular idea that someone else may hold is almost a crazy idea. But if you talk to them about it, maybe they can explain to you and help you understand why they think that, at least, okay? So just sort of understanding those reasons behind the viewpoints, understanding that they exist, can be valuable in a democracy. And this ties into a second positive outcome of exposure to disagreement or difference, and that is when we have that exposure, it increases our beliefs in the legitimacy of outcomes, even when they don't go our way. And this was hugely important in the United States in the 2020 election, because so many people in this country who were supporters of Donald Trump questioned the legitimacy of the election when Donald Trump didn't win it. And there were lots of reasons, spreading of misinformation by Donald Trump and many others for why people believed that. But another reason why people don't believe in the legitimacy of outcomes is because they don't know anybody who holds that opposite view. They haven't sat down and listened to and understood the perspective of people on the other side. And when you don't do that, it's hard to imagine that there's anybody that thinks that. That was kind of that headline that I began my talk with, about 60 million people voting for a candidate, and you've never talked to those other people. Finally, talking to people that you disagree with can increase tolerance for the opposition. And tolerance is a fundamental value in liberal democracies. Basically, what tolerance does is it says you have a right to exist. You have a right to live your life, even though it's different from me. You have a right to all the same freedoms that I have, even if I disagree with you. So to be intolerant is to take away people's freedoms because you don't like them. And so when we talk to people who are different from us, we become more likely to tolerate them. That doesn't mean we like them more, but we'll tolerate those viewpoints. And we have to tolerate difference in a democracy. Otherwise, it turns to civil war. We have to sort of accept that everybody is equally deserving of the same rights, even if we don't agree with them. So in the US, over the past 4 or 5 years, regularly we look to magazines or newspapers or the internet, and we find articles with titles like this: Keeping It Civil, How to Talk Politics Without Letting Things Turn Ugly, or How to Talk Politics Without Starting Fights and Ruining Relationships. There's a sort of a cliche in the United States that during our Thanksgiving celebrations in November, when families get together to share a large meal, that political conflict will happen, and it's always the uncle. The uncle has these political views that don't agree with the rest of the family. And so many times these articles will come out around Thanksgiving saying basically, how will you talk politics with the uncle who holds these viewpoints that you can't stand? And I have what I think is an answer. I'm not the only one with this answer, but I think that I have an answer of how we can move past the problems that we're facing today. It begins by saying, what is conversation? And let's just imagine in this yellow circle that whatever conversation is fits in this yellow circle. So this is all conversation. The first thing we have to do is remember something that I think too many people have forgotten. And that is that conversation is not just speaking, it's listening. Okay, so if we think about all of conversation, I think maybe we should divide it down the middle and think only half of conversation is expressing viewpoints. The other half is listening and trying to understand the expressions of others. And too much in political communication research, I think too much in our daily lives, we seem to prioritize the expression side of things and fail to pay attention to how important listening is. But once we divide this yellow circle in two and we say there's expression and there's listening, now we have to pare down and look more closely, specifically at political conversation. Political conversation is different than talking about the weather, than talking about sports teams or your favorite movies or something like that. Political conversation is a subset of all conversation. And then political conversation across lines of difference is even a subset of that. And that red circle there in the middle is what is particularly important for democracy and where the idea of a combination of listening and expression is important, not just focusing on expression. Now, what do I mean about difference? What are the lines of difference? And these really vary from country to country. In the United States, candidates and political parties are important lines of difference where we have to talk. So people who supported Donald Trump or Joe Biden in the United States, or people who support the Democratic and Republican parties, that's one line of difference that we might cross. In the United States, issues of race and ethnicity are another very important line of difference because of the history of the United States. The United States has really been experiencing a racial reckoning over the past several years, maybe even longer than the past several years. And one of the things that I've been studying is understanding how Black people and white people talk to one another. And different countries have different histories with combinations of indigenous people and non-indigenous people, or various racial and ethnic groupings, language groupings, where that would be the dimension of difference that would be important. Sex and gender can be important lines of difference in some countries. We tend to have more contact across sex or gender lines than we do across a number of these other characteristics because of heterosexual marriage and how families are structured. But it still is an important line of difference when it comes to talking about different viewpoints about politics. And as I've already mentioned, in Mexico, the research suggests that three very important lines of difference that are relevant in federal elections for president are religion, income, and geography. And so maybe these are specific lines of difference that we should focus on in the Mexican context. So what I want to do is I want to focus now on the idea of listening and spend the rest of my time talking about that. John Dryzak, who is an important political theorist, a political philosopher, in his book, Deliberative Democracy and Beyond, says the most effective and insidious way to silence others in politics is a refusal to listen. What he's saying here is that taking away listening, not listening, is actually a terrible thing to do to other people, and it can take away their voice. It can take away essentially their right to express their opinion. And so we can imagine when someone does this to us, that is really insulting, when they clearly signal to us they're not going to listen to us. And so this kind of by its absence highlights the importance of the presence of listening, of communicating, of signaling that you are listening to the other person. But what do I mean about listening? What do I mean when I say listening? Am I just saying, oh, I know what you said, I heard the words? Or do I mean something more important? And another political theorist, Benjamin Barber, in his book Strong Democracy, I think puts it very well. He says, I will listen means to the strong Democrat, and that's not the political party Democrat in the US, that means someone who supports democracy. I will listen means to the strong Democrat, not that I will scan my adversary's position for weaknesses and potential trade-offs, nor even that I will tolerantly permit him to say whatever he chooses. It means rather, I will put myself in his place. I will try to understand. I will strain to hear what makes us alike. I will listen for a common rhetoric evocative of a common purpose or a common good. What Barber is saying is that it's listening and trying to take the perspective of the other person, trying to understand why they think and feel the way they do, trying to empathize with the challenges that they face, and maybe just sort of understanding how their background, their life experiences can lead them to hold different viewpoints than we do because they grew up in different socioeconomic circumstances, because they grew up in a different region of the country, because they grew up being raised in a different religious tradition, because they grew up with a different tone of skin color that led them to have different interests, different priorities, different life experiences. That's what listening means, is trying really hard for that when the other person is talking. There have been a number of books in the past 10 or 15 years now that have highlighted from a deliberative democratic theory perspective the importance of this idea of listening. And I've been happy with some of my co-authors that I highlighted in my title slide to start to look at this empirically, to understand who is and who isn't listening, in what sorts of situations are people finding it easier or harder to listen. But I'm not going to really talk about that in great detail, but rather, instead of focusing on the research, just sort of focusing on the ideas that you can take and maybe apply in your own life to try to make democracy better. And in doing so, I want to introduce an idea that my friend Hernando Rojas, who is originally from Colombia, he is a professor in the United States, and he is also the primary researcher for the Colombia data from the Comparative National Elections Project that I referenced earlier. Hernando has this idea of understanding orientation, which is derived from the ideas of someone called Jürgen Habermas, who was a political philosopher. And basically, this idea of an understanding orientation is a way that people go into political conversations that ties very closely to the idea of listening. So we can see Hernando says, if you agree with statements like, in political conversations, it is paramount to listen carefully to what others have to say. Or, when I talk politics, it is more important for me to learn than to convince. Or, skipping down here towards the bottom, talking about politics lets me understand why others see things differently. The idea behind Hernando's understanding orientation is that if you enter politics with this kind of strategy or approach, then democracy may be improved, compared to if you enter a political conversation with someone who you disagree and you're just trying to prove them wrong, or you're trying to persuade them, you're trying to win points. If you enter a political conversation with someone whom you disagree as if it's a sporting event that one of you will win and the other will lose, really maybe both people lose and democracy loses. Instead, you have to understand it, political conversations with people who disagree or who are different. You have to think about those conversations as a game that you have to collaborate together to win. You have to understand one another. You have to figure out, yes, we're different in some regards. We hold different opinions, but what do we share? What can we figure out that is something that we can agree on to move towards a common good? And I think this is a very important point that he makes. And so this brings up an idea that interpersonal communication researchers and people who study things like marriages and workplace conflict have highlighted. And that is that there are many strategies that we can use to sort of address when we disagree. One is to avoid conflict or disagreement. But that's actually not a very good strategy, because nothing gets solved if we avoid. And so this idea of avoiding goes back to the notion of how maybe a third of Mexican citizens and 30% of American citizens don't talk to people who differ from them politically. That's problematic. Accommodating is a strategy where you basically give in. You concede your viewpoints and let the other side win. And that's not a good strategy either. That's not fair to you as an individual to just give up your viewpoints and let somebody else win. So also not a good conflict management strategy for democracy. Competing seems to be, at least in the United States, where we're stuck. And this is like a sporting event. This is fighting. This is both sides working really hard to win the game by as many points as possible. Compromising is better, but compromising is less than ideal. Compromising means I'll let you win some if you let me win some. Or actually, in the line from a TV show that I was just watching last night, it means compromise means I'm half happy because I win halfway, but I don't win the other halfway. And so compromising isn't ideal, but it's certainly better than the first three. Maybe the best approach, even though it's hard, is what's called creative problem solving. And that, more than these others, is where listening comes in. Because creative problem solving doesn't mean I give up half of what I want and you give up half of what you want. Rather, it means maybe we can work together to find a solution where neither of us has to give up much of anything. We can find a third way where both of us win. Okay. So in order to do that creative problem solving, we have to listen to one another. And so the other important thing, because you may be asking like, yeah, listening sounds great, but those people on the other side, they won't listen to me. They don't listen. That's the problem. It's their fault. And, you know, maybe it is. But there is something that our research suggests is possible. You be the change. You take the first step. Let's start with you listen. Okay? If you open things up and say you will listen to them first, you seek that first step to understand the perspective of someone who is different from you. There is this idea called reciprocity. It exists in human relations throughout history, back to historic times and to today. If I do you a favor, you have this tendency to want to do that favor back for me. If we're walking together and we go into a building or a restaurant, and I open the door and allow you to walk in front of me, and then there's another door just inside the building, odds are you're going to stop and open the door back for me and allow me to go first. Okay? The idea of reciprocity in listening is important. And people tend to listen to others when they think that they themselves are being listened to. And if they think they're not being listened to, they will not listen to other people. So if you want to win the game for everybody, for democracy, take the chance and you listen first and see what happens. And then hopefully the result of that, of two people listening, is it produces what Hernando Rojas called the understanding in politics. We start to see the other person's perspective. We start to understand why they do what they do, and maybe we can come to some mutually positive resolution. And so I want to close with just two strategies, two slides that address concrete strategies for what you might do to engage in what's called effective informational listening. The first thing, just respect the other person's point of view. Allow them to hold their perspective, even if you disagree with it. So you don't have to agree, but respect it. The second thing is to separate the message from the speaker. Don't, and this ties into the third point, don't sort of judge that individual because of the ideas that they have expressed. Maybe they're just bad at expressing ideas. So focus on the message that the person is saying and not making sort of inherent judgments about the person. And sit back and wait. Don't judge. Don't argue prematurely. Just listen. There's time for judgment later. Next, look for key ideas. Try to understand the themes, the major points that the person is trying to convey. And even maybe you need to ask some sincere, not counterfeit, not trick questions, but sincere questions to try to clarify the meaning and generate additional detail. And even check your understanding by paraphrasing. Say, wait, help me understand. Is this what you're saying? Is this what you mean? But again, not in a nasty way, not in a tricky way, not in a way where it appears you're trying to point out to them that you found a flaw in their thinking. Just try to understand their thinking. In closing, I want to show you an assignment that I give to my undergraduate students in my course I teach in political communication. And they are supposed to go and do this. And what they have told me is most of them, not all of them, most of them found this experience really refreshing. Here's what they did. I tell them, choose a friend or a relative or an acquaintance who you believe identifies with a different political party than you do, or who supports a candidate from a different political party than you do. Ask that person to give you 30 minutes of time where they're simply going to share their political viewpoints with you. And you have to make clear that during this time, you will not be sharing your own viewpoints. You can do that later for the assignment, but you just have to sit back and listen and maybe ask questions. But you don't get to say what you think. You don't get to argue your reasoning. Just listen. It's amazing how many people will say, yes, I'd be happy to tell you what my viewpoints are for a half hour. And then I tell my students, come prepared with some non-leading questions so that you can try to understand this person's viewpoints on major issues. Probe their answers for understanding, kind of make it the goal to be that you understand the person, not that you've persuaded them or defeated their ideas. Try to find the underlying values that they're expressing that you might share. Underlying values like freedom or equality or justice or public order. And then try to summarize your understanding, kind of give their ideas back to them to make sure that you understand them. What tends to happen is after this half-hour process where my students listen to this other person, the other person then is interested in like, okay, now you've been silent for a half hour. I want to hear what you have to say. And I think that can be the beginning to a decline in the polarization that we see in the United States and in Mexico, and maybe an increase in democracy overall. I thank you so much for the time that you have given to listen to me, and I really look forward to answering as best I can any questions that you may have.
Monterey is a election year, so I had a lot of questions about that. First, says for you the geographical location is very important. It's a very important factor in elections, according to you. So, would you love to know why? Can you explain why this is very important? Why the geographical location? Sorry, my English is very rusty right now, but I will do my best. Okay, and can you explain why the geographical location is very important for you? And if you think that Mexicans are more likely to seek people with the same political ideologies, affecting polarization in her opinion, will always be present in our society, even if we start opening our social groups to include different political ideologies?
Great question. I think each country has its own history, and each of these characteristics where geography matters may have a different explanation. In one factor in the United States where there is a difference between the urban areas, the cities, and rural areas, the countryside, is that those regions have different political needs. Urban areas are fundamentally different. People are crammed much closer together, and there are different sorts of people in the United States who live in urban areas versus rural areas. Education tends to be easier to get in the major urban areas. In the rural areas, the economies may be based more on vegetables, produce, farming, or on things like mining. Whereas in the urban areas, they are more on sort of factories and production, but also on service areas. And so the political needs of people can differ in geographical areas. In the US, for most of the US, African Americans, Black people, tend to be more concentrated in urban areas. And because of the history of racism in the United States, kind of the political needs of Black people are in some ways different from the political needs of white people. And so that rural areas that are very white have different political needs than urban areas, which have a much more diverse population and higher percentage Black people. There are also issues relating to sort of the historical migration patterns that exist in the United States, but perhaps in Mexico as well, I'm not sure. But people from different countries settled different parts of the United States, and I think that also affects things in terms of geography. I think the second part of your question was about longstanding, or will it change anything to open our networks? And I do believe it would, because I think the research suggests that when we're physically separated from people who are different from us, that makes us even more suspicious of them and makes us exaggerate our differences from them because they live on this side of town and we live on that side of town. And so I think if we can build friendships, if we can close the physical distance between us, it can help to some degree. Terrific question.
Ready. Okay, thank you, Sheep. We have some more questions, but right now, this question is gonna appear in the screen. So please, production. Okay. What happens when ideas or messages come from hate ideals?
Yeah, this is wonderful, a wonderful and important question. And it's a classic challenge, and I don't think that researchers have come to a clear agreement on this. There are some who would say that when their viewpoints or when their reasons are illiberal, that their idea says you don't deserve to exist, that you don't have rights, that we no longer have to listen to them. That if that is truly the case, in the case of racism, of religious intolerance, of opposition to who someone is, that we should not listen to them. There are others, though, who would argue that even in those circumstances, unless we're ready to go to war, unless we're ready to start eliminating one another, we really have no choice but to try to find common ground, to try to come together. But I absolutely agree that is maybe the greatest challenge, is in those circumstances. And we talk about some of that in the research that I brought up on the screen that we published last year as well. Great question.
Thank you, Chip. Okay, and the next question, please, in the screen. Why do you think in Ohio that the rural counties support Trump and the urban counties with the larger cities supports Biden?
Yeah, well, this is a pattern that exists throughout the United States. It exists at the level of states, where more rural states tend to support Democrats, or I'm sorry, more rural states tend to support Republicans, but happens within states as well. And again, part of it is a function of the racial makeup of urban and rural areas. With the exception of some southern states, Black Americans tend to live in more urban cities or suburban areas surrounding those cities. The exception is in a couple of places in the southern United States, there are rural areas that have heavy concentration of African Americans that tend to support Joe Biden and Democrats. So part of it is a racial issue, but part of it really is how other matters such as religiosity, which tends to be higher in rural areas than in cities, and economic matters. So the geography is a mix of some other characteristics like religion, like race, like education, like socioeconomic status. These things are not necessarily distinct. They're all kind of interlinked, at least in the American case. And I would suspect in the Mexican cases as well, that there are multiple factors regarding poverty and wealth, regarding the sorts of economic issues, like what sort of industries are dominant, and even issues like the percentage of the population that is Catholic or not, and the percentage of the population that is indigenous or not, that kind of relate together. But perhaps I'm wrong there.
Okay, thank you, Chip. One last question. It's from a teacher of here, and it's, can accurate of the studies you carry out to be affected when measuring political belief in Mexico because of the digital access gaps and inequalities?
Absolutely. I think not just in Mexico, but in many countries as well. In the United States, there have been some degree of inaccuracy in understanding election outcomes in 2016 and 2020 because of the move to online polling as a more prominent feature in US politics, and misrepresentation of and difficulty accessing less educated rural voters, and therefore undercounting support for Donald Trump. But also something that they have called in the US the shy Trump voter syndrome. That is, that people with some viewpoints are just less willing to participate in surveys, regardless of access, or less willing to admit they support a candidate that many people oppose. I would assume that these things exist in Mexico as well. I was not directly involved in the gathering of the data from Mexico and Colombia that I presented earlier, And I'll be honest, I don't know whether those were telephone surveys or whether those were online surveys. But I do think that matters, and it's a real challenge for public opinion researchers in many countries.
We got a bonus question, sorry. One more question.
I'm happy to.
Okay, thank you. Do you think that people's inability to discuss different political viewpoints relies on their lack of emotional intelligence?
Perhaps. I'm trying to think of sort of the right way that the person who asked the question is thinking of emotional intelligence to make sure that I'm understanding it the right way. But I do think if the question means sort of an inexperience in handling disagreement and conflict, absolutely. I think that it's not just in the political realm where we are challenged in handling conflict. You know, a lot of the research that I've talked about is about conflict in marriage relationships. And, you know, there are many cliches in the United States, maybe they exist in Mexico as well, in terms of how husbands and wives, for instance, may handle conflict in terms of avoiding conflict versus just giving in rather than having conflict. And I think because of the way that our lives exist, that we just, across characteristics, we tend to associate with people who share our relative level of wealth, of our relative level of education, right? If there is a group of 600 students sitting in the audience there, you're probably almost all about the same age. Almost all of you have about the same education. All of you are living in the same place. So much is similar about you. We get very used to communicating with people who are similar to us. And it becomes a real challenge, a difficulty talking to someone different from us in any characteristic. And then we add politics to it, and it just is harder. So it's something we can practice, I think, in our everyday lives, is getting out of our comfort zone, interacting with people, learning something about people who are different.
Yes, I'm agree. And I think right now it's very important the role of social media. Here in this moment in Monterrey, it's like a popularity contest, like who made better TikTok, who made better YouTube, who made better Facebook, who made better videos, who made better songs. And that's not political, it's just a popularity contest. And all the people are exposed to that and make his decision or give his vote just because he saw on social media or because have more followers or something like that. So I think it's very important the intelligence about emotions, like how you feel and what you transmit to other people. Because without that, you can make a right decision.
Yeah.
Okay, Chip. Well, before finish this transmission, we want to give you this certificate for participation. Thank you for being here with us and for your collaboration as master speaker with this International Communication Week 2021 in its academic. Thank you very much. We hope to have you here back and very soon.
I would love to, and thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure entirely. I only wish I was able to meet your students in person. Maybe next time. Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure. And well, this is for all the people that hear us. Agradecemos su tiempo y conexión a esta conferencia, así como el de nuestras autoridades. Los invitamos a continuar participando en las distintas conferencias magistrales los siguientes días de esta Semana Internacional de la Comunicación 2021. Por estas mismas plataformas, Facebook y YouTube. Muchas gracias y que tengan todos muy buenas tardes. Recuerden estar al pendiente de las redes sociales de la Facultad de Ciencias de la Comunicación. Chip, muchas gracias.
Gracias.